Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, a panel discusses Illinois' culture of corruption in its government and public affairs, and what changes might bring a culture of good government to the state. This is one of 3 such panels organized by the Institute for Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois. This runs about 1 hour.
For cultural kind of issue. What I thought we'd do in this panel is begin with Bob Rich, and I've asked him to give a summary of his thoughtful and substantial paper about public learning, or you might say culture change. Ask for quick reactions from any of the panelists, and then turn to Paul Green, who always has some fascinating observations to make, and then to Terry and to Kent. So we'll begin with Bob.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought I might start with 2 stories that help set a context. Some of you will remember Mayor Richard J. Daley many years ago was holding a press conference, and he was asked whether or not it was true that all the city's insurance business went to his son's firm. And Daley stood up straight, Mayor Daley stood up straight, and he said, "Yes, that's true, and what father wouldn't want to help his son?" And then the second quote, a bit more personal. My father, who was in the private insurance business, had as one of his clients the executive director of the State Department of Revenue, and I was graduating high school and about to enter college, and my father called this man and said, "Can you help my son get a summer job?" So I'll come back to those 2, and indeed I got a summer job at the Department of Revenue. I want to start by reflecting a little bit on some of what was said in the last panel. I think it's important to think about the impact of laws is limited. We can have laws, we can even have the enforcement of laws, but the impact of those laws, I think, is limited in terms of changing the culture. So I disagree with the notion that I heard that if 90% of the laws were actually enforced, we'd have a cultural change. Not clear to me that that's really the case, nor am I clear that campaign finance reform by itself will change the culture. So I start with the notion that the frame of mind that we have as residents of Illinois is particularly important. That was referenced to in the first panel as well. And I think we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we learn this frame of mind? How is that reinforced over time? The extent to which it's accepted over time as well, and the extent to which we find the frame problematic at all. One of the things I think about the frame of mind in Illinois is that when someone hears my colleague Dick Simpson talk, I think Dick automatically assumes that, of course, everyone will agree that what he's talking about is a problem. But that's not clear to me. It's not clear to me that we as residents of Illinois all think that it's a problem. That causes me to say that I think we need to pay a bit more attention to, let's define what the problem actually is. And the colleagues here from the Medill project, I thought, were very good at raising the question of what is the problem we're trying to address? Is it a broad ethical issue? Is it really the use of public officials for private gain? And is it a problem of the executive director of the Department of Revenue giving me a summer job because my father asked that I got a summer job and I didn't compete for that? So I believe that we need to ask ourselves the question of how do we change frames of mind, frames of reference. And I really strongly believe that how you define the problem ultimately leads to the extent to which you're going to formulate public policy on a issue. And indeed, I believe that how you frame the problem either leads to having meaningful dialogue and deliberation about an issue or not. So for example, as long as the problem of public financing of abortion is defined as either pro-choice or pro-life, we'll never have a meaningful dialogue, in my opinion, on the problem. There'll never really be deliberation on the problem that will lead to cultural change. And instead, we'll just have more and more reinforcement of cultural change. And by the way, if you need any more proof for that, is the difference between Rick Santorum on the one hand and Mitt Romney on the other hand. Mitt Romney wants us to believe that the economy is the issue and he's the one who can deal with the economy. And Santorum wants us to believe that we all need to have the courage that he does to talk about troubling social issues and social values kinds of issues. And let's be clear, he's gaining a lot of traction, at least in some of Jim Edgar's party's circle as well. So I'm concerned with, as my paper talks about, with the topic of what I'm calling public learning. And in public learning, I'm building on Don Schoen's work for many years ago. And the definition of public learning is a fundamental change in the beliefs and attitudes of publics, broad constituencies, and most importantly, transforming that change of beliefs and attitudes into actions. And I think public learning is broad. It's not just politics. It is society as a whole, including the arts and education and other parts of society too. And so the scope is broad. And then I want to, just for purposes of the discussion this morning, just take one example, although there are other examples in the paper. And I want to take the example of regulation of smoking in public places in the United States. I remember in 1959, the first time that I ever took a international airline trip. And the left-hand side of the airplane was the smoking side of the airplane, and the right-hand side of the airplane was the non-smoking side of the airplane. And that was on the assumption that the smoker's individual rights are every bit as credible and legitimate as the non-smoker's rights. And now, a mere 50 some odd years later, which in societal problem solving terms is a short period of time, we have fundamentally changed our frame of reference in society, more so in this country than any other country in the world. And now the frame that's most important is the impact of secondhand smoke. And we no longer believe that the rights of the non-smoker, of the smoker as an individual is every bit as legitimate and credible as the rights of the non-smoker, because we know from research that smoking has secondary effects on non-smokers as well. And one can talk now to talk about how broad this is. As many of you in this room will remember, it was not long ago that in movies and television shows, when somebody wanted to celebrate an event, something really good in their life, they lit up as noting that this was a celebratory kind of event. I don't think you find that any longer in terms of public television shows or movies. So it's this change in culture, if you will, or change in frame of reference has broadly permeated society. And so my own belief is that if we want to make progress on the ethics area and corruption as a subset of the ethics area, public learning is a good handle for how to do that, and trying to change the frame of reference of how we talk about it, how we define the problem, and convince and persuade folks all the way from grammar school on up that this is a good idea. So I think change can happen. I think we can bring about cultural change. I think smoking is a good example of it, but not the only one. HIV/AIDS is another good example of it. You'll all will remember that in early 1980s, HIV/AIDS was framed as the disease of homosexuals. And we've now transformed that into believing that it is a broad disease having to do with blood products in general, and transfusion of blood is another place where this is important. So anyhow, I believe that change can happen. I believe it's a long-term process, and I believe we need to focus in on how we define the issue, the frames of reference, and reinforcing those broadly in society.
Thank you, Bob. Would anybody like to respond to that before offering your own opening comments?
Just quickly, in what one thing that I was struck in reading the paper is when we're talking about cultural change in relation to smoking or abortion, there's a much greater focus on, we kind of know when it happens or when it doesn't happen. And when we're talking about cultural change in relation to attitudes about government or corruption, that's much more diffused. I mean, it is, there's a lot more facets to that than whether you can smoke in a room or not smoke in a room. I mean, the issues, public policy tends to have beginnings and ends and yeses and nos, and this is, political culture and corruption are process sorts of things. So I think the models are very interesting. I thought it was a very interesting paper, but I was struck as I was thinking about it about how dealing with process is in some ways, change is different than dealing with policy.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
I mean, let me just give you two examples, Kent, or counter examples of what you're talking about. One of them is there are states where redistricting discussions are framed in different ways and are thought of in different ways. Redistricting in Iowa, for example, is framed, talked about in different ways. And if you ever tried to do in Illinois what's done in Iowa, you'd be told, I think, a la a public learning discussion, we don't do it that way here in Illinois. We've never done it that way and won't. And the other one is term limits. There are states where term limits are accepted and have been accepted for a long time. In Illinois, even those candidates who say they're going to have self-imposed term limits change their mind. My own congressman from Champaign-Urbana, Tim Johnson, is a great example of somebody who ran on, I'm going to have a self-imposed term limit, and has chosen not to. So I think political processes are open to the same kind of dynamic here.
I agree. I think those things can change. But redistricting is different than patronage, is different than, and so there's a lot of balls up in the air in terms of this. That makes it hard to kind of talk about, a yes or no decision or the magic bullet, that kills the werewolf or the silver bullet, and we all live happily ever after. And this is a more complex sort of, processes are more complex than policy, I think.
My turn?
Yeah.
All right. I have nothing to say on any of that. So there you go. Let's just clear the air right now. By the way, I do have something to say. We may have dealt with smoking, but by abolishing it in many places, but we still tax the hell out of it, and people who do smoke we call philanthropists. And as far as Iowa redistricting is concerned, sorry, I gave this line out already. Yeah, they may do a great job in redistricting, but they lose precincts. So if that happened in Illinois, they would have, well, I have made the suggestion that in 2016, the Chicago Board of Elections will be running the Iowa caucuses. That way we could have a fair and honest count. At least all the precincts will be reported. But coming to what I prepared to do was, this is the first panel or conference that I've ever been to where the three key words are is, can, and how. I just think that's incredibly clever. And it's all the same topic, but you get three panels out of it. That's good. I like that. Also, for those of you who weren't, how many of you were born and raised in Chicago? Raise your hand. There you go. Lasky left. He knew what was coming. All right. By the way, corruption in Illinois is only about money and power. We've never had a sex scandal. And there's no babe in Argentina for any Illinois person. They're not interested in that. And talking about reform and machine politics is basically a job protection plan for reformers. If it ever happened, a lot of people would be looking for work. Judicial public funding of judicial candidates would be a disaster. You'd have hundreds of people asking for state money when there isn't any to run for judge. The only way you do it is merit selection. You shouldn't elect any judge. That's from my former Supreme Court Judge, Bill Clark, who had that idea 30 years ago. And if you ever have been elected official at a local level and people claim that they're getting inundated with mosquitoes, you better damn well believe that is a big issue, a huge issue. People understand getting bit by mosquitoes. Those are my comments. Now let's get what I prepared. 3 points. Since 1818, Illinois never or seldom has ever had reform government. Why? Most important reason is the people are against it. No one tricks anybody in this game. You vote whatever way you vote, political science 101, you vote your pocketbook, you vote your personal interests. 2, the advocates of, I'm sorry, if I have it written down though, so you know I'm not stealing your line. Advocates often don't do a very good job of advocating reform that will work. And when reform does come, there's seldom a reward. 3 years ago, or was it 2 years ago, Jim, we had the retrospective on Dick Ogilvy, who was lauded for all of his incredible bravery in putting the first state income tax into effect. And it was so good for Illinois. It wasn't very good for Dick Ogilvy, who lost in a Republican landslide to a charlatan named Dan Walker. So much for state income tax. And now, after he's gone, like 50 years later, 40 years later, everyone's saying what a great guy he was. He lost an election that should have been an easy win. But the city of Chicago, where I, except for my 4 years at Champaign-Urbana, where I've lived in the vicinity and in the city, in 1837, there has never, or even less seldom, had been a reform government, though every mayor has run as a reformer. You're always a reformer. Why are you a reformer? Because you say you're a reformer. We're all reformers. Everybody's a reformer. What's the alternative? It's like those people who advocate smart growth. What's the alternative? Of course I'm for smart growth. Who wants to be done growth? So everyone's a reformer. And once you get in office, you realize that people don't want it. There's just no reason for it. And part of it has to do, and I hate the word culture, but part of it has to do for specific reasons. Much of the reform of the late 19th and early 20th century was dealing with keeping those new people who were coming in from ruining our city and eventually ruining our state. Reform has often been a cover-up for being anti-immigrant, anti-minority, nonpartisan elections, running at large, a direct primary, all the things that were groups who are coming in without much power, without much influence, could elect people of their own, have always been looked down upon by the people who have been there already. The we versus the they. I won't go into it, Hilmy, but my rant. And so you have this continuously going on where reform is used as a cover to maintain power. And so when you look at Harold Washington's victory in '83, our colleague Billy Grimshaw at IIT, I think he's retired now. Well, if you sell your house for what he sold his house for next to President Obama's house, you could retire. He did an absolutely brilliant 180. He said reform under Harold Washington is nothing like the old traditional notion of reform. It's called fairness. And that's why Jesse Jackson would never be allowed anywhere near Harold Washington, because that night of that election, what did he say? It's our turn. I seldom agree with Reverend Jackson, but he was right on target then. So what you have then is that you have to define what reform means, and is it workable? Governmentally, watch this, Mr. Simpson, governmentally, who is the greatest reformer in Chicago history? It's easy, Richard J. Daley. Clearly, the number one reformer. He changed the budget process, having an executive budget, home rule, fair representation for the city of Chicago. Our downstate friends thought that the 1901 redistricting was so good that why change it? In 1955, it was the same map. Chicago had 3.5 million people, the suburbs had grown, and Rich Daley and Bill Stratton, who's never gotten his credit for being one shrewd politician, including a shrewd politician in Chicago, they cut a deal which gave the city of Chicago and the suburban Cook County fair representation. These are all reforms. We could go on, including running the city council like a city council instead of like a zoo. Before Daley, when you did the budget, where did you go to? Remember, it was a council-driven budget? The air in Chicago just wasn't right for doing budgets. So you went to Hot Springs, Arkansas, good place to do budgeting. There's governor, a lot of horses there and other things. Or French Lick, Indiana, and then you come back with the budget. That wasn't going to happen under Daley. So we could talk about it all we want, but one of the ironies of all this, and unfortunately the exit, I'm in good shape, never mind. One of the ironies out of this, which I love to talk about and no one else does, is that with all this criticism of Illinois and Chicago, with all this stuff about unfairness to minorities, unfairness to new groups coming in, 3 basic points. The reason the Chicago Democratic machine lasted longer than any other machine, if you read some of the books I've done, you know what's coming. It was the last machine to be developed. It didn't happen until 1931. Many of the people that worked under Rich Daley were there at the beginning, and it lasted for 50 years. There's remnants left now, but mainly people at, as my old pal Mel Holly used to say, having wine and cheese in Hyde Park, talk about the machine because they're so used to it. But with that said, and the whole notion that the machine in Chicago was the only political organization that incorporated blacks, African Americans, at that time Negroes, into the organization. They didn't care what color you were, as long as you voted the right way. In fact, they didn't even care if you knew it was the Democratic Party, because if you lived in Chicago, and during those days, it never said vote Democratic. It said pull lever A. And by luck, lever A was always the Democratic Party. An incredible string of luck. It just happened that way. Number 2, but this kind of politics has produced, and name me a state anywhere in the Union that can challenge the following statements. 2 African American senators. Chicago, 2 African American mayors. Cook County, 3 African American county board presidents. And oh yes, that guy in the White House. By the way, not one of these individuals was a suburbanite or even a lakefront liberal. Where do they all come from? Well, that hotbed of machine politics, Hyde Park. That's my best line. This crowd is Hyde Park is by University of Chicago that allegedly has reform. For those of you youngsters from Medill, living in the Republic of Evanston, that's a neighborhood on south side of Chicago. So, just want to clarify that. I'm almost done. So, my remarks are intended to move the debate beyond good guys versus bad guys, because there are good guys and bad guys in all areas. But why reform at all levels in this city and in this state usually is more rhetoric than reality. And it has always amazed me, and I have no oar in the water, whatever you want, any metaphor, any cliche you want, but it always, all the research I've done going way, way, way back, is that, including Richard J. Daley, there never was any, though they wrote about it, there was no con job, there was no ruse. When the precinct captain knocked on our door, we knew exactly what he wanted. He was far more honest than these bloggers who claim they're for American democracy or all this other BS they pass around. These guys wanted you to vote their way because their job depended on it. Understandable. If you needed a pothole fix, he could do it. It made a lot of sense. It also created the atmosphere that government was there not just for the wealthy, for the educated, but there for the common person. And I have not been convinced. There's a politician in Springfield who always says, I'm not yet convinced that if you go to a straight, true reform, that public services will be done better. It may be cheaper because you cut out all the damn corruption. And I've been against corruption from the very beginning, from the 3 places I've taught, the Chicago Police Academy, Governor's State, and now Roosevelt. And I hate corruption because it's terrible. But providing services is what public service is all about. And I want to know the mechanism that you do it. Last point. Rahm Emanuel. Just because there's a book coming out in the 4th edition of the Mayors that has nothing to do with my final statement. Not at all. Remember, I'm a reformer. If you look at Rahm Emanuel's election, and this is going to be a little preview, Mr. Simpson, so don't necessarily steal this. I tell you will. Rahm Emanuel got elected on a modified Harold Washington coalition, the Lakefront and African American wards. And that is the reality. So now, the Lakefront liberals, like Dick Simpson from the old Fighting 44th, and others, are now part of the majority coalition along with the African American wards. And if Lasky was here, we'd end with this. Look at the remap, and you will see quite clearly that coalition is calling the shots.
Thank you, Paul. Provocative as always. Turn to Terry and then to Kent.
No questions.
Oh.
No.
All right, well, that's pretty intense, but I will do my best. Paul, I'm going to take you on a couple of the statements that you made so we can...
You wouldn't be the first
All
one.
right, well, that's good. That's why we're here, right? Okay, first of all, I disagree with you that the people are against reform. I disagree with you for a couple of reasons. Number one, at the end of 2010, the McCormick Foundation funded a report called the Civic Health Index. And in it, one of the statistics came out that of those people surveyed, less than 10% of individuals had attended a government meeting where a public policy issue was discussed in that year. That, to me, is unacceptable. And I think where we get that statistic from is a result of a variety of factors, which I'm sure we'll talk about. That's number one. Number two, I think that it's not that people are against whatever we define reform as much as we have to do a better job of connecting dinner table issues of jobs, taxes, and health care to process-based reforms around redistricting, campaign finance, ethics. How do the quote-unquote reforms that I'm one of those goo-goos that we talked about in the first panel that I represent, how do those process-based issues directly affect the dinner table issues that everybody cares about? The second thing is that, I have to do some defending here because I'm a reformer, and we're not in the business of protecting our jobs and in advocacy efforts. I think it's that the reform organizations, we are constantly in the position of playing defense. Constantly in the position of playing defense, and there is very little funding to do reform kind of work. There are many foundations in the Chicago area that do a great job of supporting a variety of organizations, but what we lack in the reform community is the ability to put together an offensive campaign that is multifaceted and multilateral. And so it's not necessarily that the reforms that are being put are job and protection programs as much as we're constantly playing defense. And how do you organize an effective campaign when you're trying to put your finger in the hole to stop the water from coming out? And then thirdly, where you were talking about immigrant community and running as a reformer and what's the alternative, I think we have to think about reform in a way that's more than just when the law gets passed, then we're done. It's the same kind of thing of having to change people's concept around because you show up at the voting booth, you've done your job. those are not the end of the game. It's the beginning of the game. You have to stay involved. Once the reform is passed, we have to figure out, is it doing what we need it to do? If it's not, how do we change it? So those are my specific comments related to, and now I'm going to get to the remarks that I prepared. So I think the answer of can corruption can the culture of corruption be changed? I think the answer is yes, but it's a marathon process. We took decades and decades and decades to get to where we are, as we talked about in the first panel, and it's going to take multi-generations to get us out of this hole. That's number one. Number two, this is not just a state of Illinois, city of Chicago problem. Our Citizen Advocacy Center is located in Elmhurst, right on the border of Cook and DuPage County. We work in the western and far western suburbs, and I can tell you this issue is all over the state of Illinois, looking at how government operates and how effective is government in doing their job. So, we have a staff of a small staff of community lawyers, and I could easily employ a staff of 20 community lawyers just to deal with the western and far western suburbs. That's number two. Number three, I think that multifaceted campaign that we focused on has to start with the baseline issue that the status quo is unacceptable. It is unacceptable. And we start with that focus, and then I think we need to look at two different segments. One, we have to look at government institutions in creating accessibility and transparency mechanisms that also have meaningful, forceful, and implemented accountability provisions. It's not enough just to say we're accessible and we're transparent, because then you get public officials co-opting the message that we're a reformer. I am transparent, I am accessible. Well, it needs to be backed up with accountability mechanisms that are actually enforced. Against that, or in addition to that, we need to have a citizenry that has the knowledge, confidence, and desire to engage in democracy, and they view it as a responsibility. And so I think that when we bring these two elements together, which is going to be decades to change this culture on both ends, we can reform, to use your term. I think we can come to a resolution here. I think also the good government groups can't do it alone. And the quote-unquote good public officials, they can't do it alone either. It needs to be a combination of grassroots campaign, so community organizing at every community, in whether you're in the city of Chicago, Elmhurst, Wheaton, Libertyville, wherever you are, you need to start getting engaged with what's happening in your town, because the public officials who start at the school board level and the municipal level, they're the ones who are eventually going to move to the county board, then they're going to move to their state rep seat, and they're going to move up the political food chain. So we have to start changing expectations now at the local level, and that starts through community organizing. The second thing is we need policy development and advocacy. Third, I have to say this because I'm an attorney, we need litigation. We need to start suing public bodies who are doing bad activities, because a lot of the activities that public officials engage in, they assume that they're not going to be sued. They weigh the factor of, maybe we'll get sued, maybe we won't, but really who has the resources out there to sue us? Very few. Third, we need broad-based coalitions. The good government organizations working alone isn't going to do it anymore. We need to reach out to the civil rights organizations, which this year we attempted to do with the Illinois Campaign for Accountable Redistricting. The Joyce Foundation did a great job of trying to bring these organizations who haven't traditionally worked together to see if we could get something done. We need to do a better job working with the media. We need to start using ballot initiatives, and most importantly, we need to have mandated civic education that is hands-on and practical learning. So the civic education needs to be more than educating students about where City Hall is, but educating students about what happens in City Hall, how do you participate in that process, and what do you do if you can't get your voice heard.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Kent Redfield.
Thanks, Jim. Can you change culture? Sure. But I think change is more effective if you clearly identify what the problems are and what is and isn't a problem. I was in a meeting involving tax increment financing, negotiations over a bill. It was after I'd left the legislature, And a person on one side of the table said, started talking about the public interest and good government. And a person on the other side of the table, who was a lobbyist, who was a former mayor, looked across the table and he said, "Sir, where I come from, good government is 6 votes on a Tuesday night." Because it was a 10-member city council, they met on Tuesday night. If you got 6 votes, you got good government. And so there's a question here that is as old as political science, but as immediate as kind of how do you make reform meaningful and work, is there a public interest? Is there, or is what we're about just the aggregating individual self-interest? You know, I can answer that. I think there's a public interest. I think that's more than just aggregating individual self-interest. But that is, Illinois is quintessentially about a political system that is about aggregating individual self-interest. And the Dick Ogilvies of the world are too rare. You know, we need people that are willing to stand up for change and to take risks. And sometimes when you stand up for change and takes, you lose your office. But that doesn't mean that this doesn't work without change at the top. When we debated the gift ban in Illinois, and this was about, you know, extortion and bribery are hard to prove, so let's establish just that you can't have exchanges of things of value between lobbyists and people who want contracts and people who make decisions. You know, let's just take it out of having to prove bribery, extortion, just say this is off limits. You can't, if you're negotiating with somebody about a contract, you can't give a gift to somebody, to the person making the decision, the procurement officer. You can't give a monetary gift to a lobbyist, to a legislator. What was the deal breaker in that conversation about gift bans that we had to get over? And I helped staff that group of 4 legislators and representing the governor's office. One of the deal breakers had to do with an exemption for wining and dining. But it wasn't called wining and dining. It was called food and beverages consumed on the premises. So you give, if I gave a legislator a frozen lobster tail and a bottle of wine and sent it to their apartment, that I broken the law. But if we went out to dinner and I bought them a lobster tail and gave them the bottle of wine, we had not broken the law. Now it's down to $75, but you know, that's Illinois politics saying there's a gray area in here, and that politics is about interaction and exchange, and that's one way of dealing with that issue. In Wisconsin, a lobbyist cannot buy a cup of coffee for a legislator. There is a bright line, zero tolerance, you can't be half pregnant kind of approach to that particular question of ethics. Now, you know, which of those is the better? Bright line, zero tolerance, or saying that politics involves exchange and interaction? You know, what the questions of, is there a public interest, or is it just aggregating individual self-interest? Those are really hard questions. I mean, lots of times in the reform community we act like these are easy. We just need to do X, and we don't get back to kind of what is the basic thing that we're talking about. So we've got a political system that treats politics as a business, as a vocation, a political system that treats politics as something for professionals by and large. You know, people I worked with in the General Assembly railed against not only the goo-goos, but the plague of women voters. And, you know, these are dilettantes. They don't have any stake in the game. If they win or lose, it's about the point. If I lose, my uncle loses their job. Okay, that's, you know, those are competing ways about thinking about politics. You know, until we have to get change at the top, and we got to get change at the bottom. We've got to get citizens involved and engaged, and yet we have elections that are basic business transactions with fine print that are designed to, you know what happens with business transactions with fine print, the little guy always gets screwed. And so, it would have been the height of irony if Rahm Emanuel would not have gotten to be mayor of Chicago because he got tripped up with the fine print having to do with residency requirements. So the system, the best way to explain this is a voter's guide. When I went to Washington State in 1970 to go to graduate school, 1969, 1970 rolls around, I get a voter's guide in my mailbox, unsolicited. It has pictures and statements of everybody that's running for local and county and state office, and statements that they put in there. It has a ton of information about how to register to vote, how to find out where my precinct is. Just, the state of Illinois, of Washington gave that to me and said, participate in the political process. Here's what's be engaged. When we pushed Voter's Guide the first time, tried to talk about a printed Voter's Guide, which is pre-internet and all of that, when it got to Pate Phillip looked at that and said, we don't need that.
Explain who Pate Phillip is.
Pate Phillip was the Senate president who was from DuPage County. And he said, my people take care of that. The precincts, the precinct workers, the party takes care of that. It's the party's job to get the message to the faithful and get the message to the polls. Now, I can't disagree with that. That's what political parties ought to do. But, it was clearly that politics is about professionals and it's about parties. And the average citizen, we like people to be engaged if we know if they're R's and D's. If they're not R's and D's, then that introduces uncertainty into the process, and we don't like uncertainty. So there's some basic attitudes about the political system, who should participate. So you have to change it at the top, you've got to change it at the bottom. But I guess I also have to weigh in on kind of the more general question. I think we have a unique political culture that facilitates and enables corruption. I don't think our politicians or Illinois politics is inherently corrupt. I think it enables and it facilitates the weak and the avarice, and I don't think that it is a given that an individualistic, private, aggregating individual self-interest, strong party kind of a politics has to be inherently corrupt. Now, we have a ton of corruption in Illinois, but I think you improve the nature of the political system and get people to participate, and that is going to make the system less corrupt. You harden the target. You make it more difficult to be corrupt. There's no question that you do that. But ultimately, it's about engaging people. 19% of the eligible voters elected Rod Blagojevich. 18% of the eligible voters voted for Judy Barr Topinka, and 63% of the eligible voters in the state of Illinois stayed home. Okay, who's the bigger dummies? The people that voted for Blagojevich or the people that stayed home? Until you engage the citizenry and make it meaningful for them, then I don't think you get, do people want reform? Politics isn't meaningful to them. It's not legitimate. If I were a politician, I'd be worried about that, because there's fewer and fewer people engaged in politics. So I want meaningful participation, and I think that gets you to doing things that you have less problems in terms of corruption, the more that you broaden participation and get more people engaged. But you're not going to, I can't answer the question, is there a public interest or is it with certainty, or is it just aggregating individual self-interest? The system works really well in aggregating individual self-interest, but it doesn't work so well in terms of what's the public interest. We had an early retirement at the end of the Ryan administration. That was a deal between the Democrats and the Republicans to get a lot of Republicans out of state government with nice early retirement systems so that we could open up jobs for the Democrats. The practical result of that was to add, pick a number, $10, $15 billion to the unfunded liability of the pension system, and to pretty much eviscerate state government in terms of the capacity. We lost a lot of capacity. And then we got a governor who wasn't interested in hiring anybody to run government, who had no, It might have, I'd be less judgmental if we had actually gotten decent people into the agencies to run them. Now, I think that's a corrupt bargain. Now, is that illegal? No. But, that's a policy outcome from the kind of politics that we have, which is over the top on exchange. But last thing I'll say is you can't reform politics unless you're willing to accept that something exists that's politics. I work with reformers, not so much anymore, but in the early days, who were offended by the political process. They wanted to reform it, but they were offended by it. They didn't like, they wanted to have politics, reformed politics that didn't have any politics in it. So these are hard things. And one more thing about campaign finance, just to bring everybody up to speed. Supreme Court has effectively killed both public financing through the Arizona Free Speech Bennett decision, and through Citizens United, we have completely done away with any hope of getting big money out of politics. Okay, so the next question is, do we just suffer in silence? No, actually, if you increase the number of small donors from like 3% to 5 or 6%, you could raise enough small money to overwhelm big money. And there are people working on that. Should we have matching? Should we have tax credits? Obama outspent McCain. They both raised about the same amount from big donors, but he combined the internet and small donors and social networking. So the tool is out there to overwhelm big money if you can figure out how to aggregate little money, which is much more realistic now. But the people in campaign finance reform have to rethink what we're about, because the idea that we're going to get big money out of politics or we're going to make elections less expensive, if that was ever realistic, and I don't think even under Buckley it was realistic, it's no longer there. So I want to think about new ways to get little money into the system that also gets people participating in the system. And if you get more people participating in the system, you're more likely to get broader results. And ultimately, I think you're going to get less corruption.
Okay, thank you very much, Kent. I think what we have, going back to the original question, is that Bob and Terry believe that culture can be changed and that the culture of politics can be changed, but that it would take decades to do so. I think that Kent is not certain about that because it's process rather than policy oriented. That is the issue of corruption in our society, and therefore is skeptical that the culture of corruption can be changed, or at least changed easily. And then we have Paul, who believes that certainly in Chicago that the system has been working and that it is a system that most of the people seem to like, and therefore, according to Paul, there's no interest in the kind of reform that many of us here would think is needed. So with that, I'll take reactions. I think Paul had a reaction, and then turn to the other three, and then to questions.
Anyone who's ever been an elected official at the local level, the one thing you don't want when you have a meeting is a big crowd. Government works best when it's boring. And the notion that it's really helpful to have citizens at your meetings is just the stuff that people talk about. But try being an elected official and run a meeting when you have a big crowd there. And even if nothing's going on illegal, most elected officials do not like large crowds, whether they are a township official, and I know one very personally, a former township official, me, or could be a school board. But usually when there's a big crowd, that means people are really angry. And when people are really angry, being an elected official becomes much tougher. It's much tougher, it's much easier to go around making off your Santa Claus than going around being Scrooge.
Terry? And then we're coming right to questions.
Well, since a good portion of my job is getting people to government meetings, I'd like to, comment on that.
We got a lot in common.
Yeah, there you go. We got more in common than not. I think that's right. And one of the things that we try to do to engage people is educate them about, that Tuesday night, Wednesday night, or Thursday night city council, school board, park district, township meeting is far more entertaining than must-see TV. Especially once you go regularly, you get to know who the public officials are and you get to know what the issues are. And you're right in terms of public officials don't like crowds of people showing up, but what they dislike even more than that are the crowds of people who consistently show up, right? It's not that big of a deal to have a couple of maybe 25, 50, 100 people show up for 2 meetings, scream and yell, feel like they've had their voice said, and then go away, and then the rest of the year, the only person in the crowd is the reporter, maybe, who's been rotated in and out of enough communities that they have no institutional history of what's going on.
Oh, no, yeah.
It's the individuals or the community group or the community watchdog group that consistently attends the meetings, knows the issues probably as well as the public officials who are on the dais, and takes action from there.
Bob has a quick,
Just a quick comment, and that is that I want to underscore the 63% figure that Kent talked about, because it seems to me that if we have any hope for long-term change, it's going to be by engaging that 63% or a good portion of that 63%. And there I think that how they learn makes a difference, but I also believe that engaging those 63% means motivate them to believe they can make a difference and should make a difference. And education at all levels, I think, is important there.
comments, questions from the audience?
Let me just one
Oh,
quick.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Kent.
because I wouldn't let it, I think we should attack corruption directly. I think that we can make improvements there, but I don't think that I think the corruption comes from the political system facilitating it rather than, either bad apples. And so I don't think you change the nature of politics without changing the underlying culture. And you can't, I agree that citizens are not engaged. I don't agree you have to accept that.
I think it was John Hagedorn in the back there with a question, then we'll come to Ray.
Thank you, Jim. It's I think the disagreements here reflect some ambiguities, Robert, in your paper, and I wonder if you could address it. The question, after reading it and listening, is that whether changing culture is a rational process or not. And that on the one hand, you have the notion, Dick has published 5 anti-corruption reports. If he only could publish 50, we'd marshal enough facts in that the people would decide to change, oh, he's right? The other hand, what Paul has done is reframe the question, is that this is government that works and people like it. And that if you look at, like, George Lakoff's work, he says, that when the frame is strong, like government working here in Chicago, the facts bounce off, right? So the issue, I think you talked about definitions, the issue is how do we frame the discussion so that the majority of people are going to accept a reform agenda?
No, I'm not sure I have much to add to what you said. I think that Paul's absolutely correct in the sense that as long as people accept the government the way it works is just fine and it's good and to our benefit, the facts will bounce off of it, and notwithstanding how many advocates we have and the like. My own, however, view of this is, I'm not sure I want to talk about rational versus irrational processes, but I do believe that if we work on education all the way from grammar school on up and give people an alternative view of what's ethical and what is good government, that we have some chance of engaging the people who just up to this point in time haven't been engaged.
Ray.
Hi, I'm Ray with Common Cause. I would say two things. One thing is, and this is something that's very dear to me, is this idea that with the Supreme Court having ruled in Arizona and in the Citizens United case that, you know, it's done, it's over. You know, I think we have to try something else, we have to try something new. And I think this is one of the things where, my organization, we've been going around in different states and talking to folks like John Loretto in Arizona, who's a Democratic Assembly leader for several years, and talking to them about what kinds of things, how are they reacting to the Arizona thing. There has to be a lot of education around what exactly came out of Citizens United, what exactly came out of Arizona. One of the things that people don't understand about Arizona is that Arizona specifically outlawed the triggering mechanism for public financing. It didn't allow public financing, it allowed a specific piece of it, and there's ways to craft it, and there's our states right now that are pushing and have pushed different variations of public financing that don't run afoul of the new Supreme Court rulings. And so it's really important to think about, as we talk about these things, is not to reinforce the meme that, oh, it's, even if it's accidentally, that, oh, shit, Citizens United came by and now we're really screwed. And I think that I hear that too often in the Google circles these days. And I think, as someone who was, although I've been here for 15 years, someone who was born and raised in a state that outlawed segregation and miscegenation laws in the 1940s, it's really easy to understand that, just because the Supreme says something doesn't really mean much. There has to be a long-term campaign that gets you to a Brown v. Board of Education, or a Loving v. Virginia. Those are things that have to happen on the ground, on a ground level. And to that point, the education is really important. I think Dick Simpson, as usual, made one of the most interesting points today, was that he casually mentioned the Wacker manual and the idea of having a 20-year plan that is inculcated into folks for basically generations. It is so strong in the communities that are really propping up the machine, where people are disenfranchised, people are poor, people do not have access to the same education levels maybe as lakefront liberals. They just come to them and say, oh, this is evil, this is bad, and for them to say, well, my trash gets picked up, or if I don't do it, my trash won't get picked up. That's the other part that people missed, we didn't mention. There's that sort of fatalism that's in there, and what else could I do? And I think you're not going to get it by just general education. You have to go through a very long process. In the community organizing field, which is basically another version of politics.
Could we?
I'm sorry, I'll let it right off. But one thing, there are people and there are groups still that teach the idea that self-interest is the way to go. It's a quid pro quo situation. So that aggregation of self-interest that was talked about, we have to do deep transformative education on all levels.
Okay, Dave Cohn.
I got to respond. We have to clear the air with facts. And short facts. Daniel Burnham was a hell of a guy. He also was a great politician. He was probably a better politician than he was an architect. The Wacker plan was pushed by the same business interests that are now behind all kinds of reform in Springfield. It was done during some of the most corrupt administrations in the history of Chicago. So let's not say that was sort of the golden era. People made a fortune off the Burnham plan with the Wacker manual. The reason it's Wacker Drive was not because for many other reasons other than a reward. You watch where that road goes, it just wasn't indiscriminately put that way. So let's not Burnham was a hell of a guy. So he was a great politician who's married very well the daughter of a former mayor. So this is not some kind of pristine thing that just happened when the gods were great. It all came about mainly during the administration of William Hale Big Bill Thompson. So that's just some facts for you youngsters from Medill who are right now getting an education that you probably never thought you'd ever get.
Thanks. I know we're getting close to the break. Just a quick question. Another thing, by the way, Daniel Burnham was a member of this club and was the club's first wine steward. So now you probably didn't know that, Paul. But,
I did not know that. I'm sure he was a good one.
I have so many questions, I don't know where to begin, but I want to get back to this notion of citizen involvement. And if we accept the proposition that a greater degree of citizen involvement in the political process will be a good thing, I'm reminded of another quote from a political theorist, the only political theorist I know who might be funnier than Paul Green, P.J. O'Rourke, who said Americans' lack of interest in government is well developed, but Americans' ignorance of government is perfect. Having been one of those sole reporters at a city council meeting and later working for an elected official, I've seen this in action. My specific question is, it seems to me that one of the things that contributes to lack of citizen involvement, at least under the system we have in this state, is our primary election system, which requires citizens to select a Republican or Democratic ballot. And my question for the panel is, do you not think that if we were to adopt a system that is used in other states where we have a so-called open primary, where candidates of all parties participate no matter what office they're running for, if you get 50% plus one in the primary, that's a de facto being elected, you'll be on the ballot, but the fall election, if you have the top two vote getters are Republicans, maybe a Republican and Democrat, I guess the point is, do you not think it could increase citizen involvement if we had everybody running? It would drive the parties absolutely out of their minds, because they could no longer effectively target voters for the campaign literature that's sent out and so forth. But do you think that changing the primary system so that you don't declare a party preference would make any difference?
Kent or Terry,
Go ahead.
well, I was going to say personally, I think that would further weaken the political parties. So I don't favor moving from our semi-closed system to an open system, but Kent may have different.
And I'm going to be exactly where Jim is. I'm a party person. I think that, voters need organizing, they need cues, they need people that, voting is hard and getting involved with politics is hard. And so functioning political parties that have content are a very valuable part of the political system because they help voters organize their thoughts and kind of make assumptions about participating in politics. I think we have, I think we need strong parties, but the parties have to stand for something. The advantage the Democrats have had over the Republicans in the last 20, 30 years in Illinois is the Democrats don't spend a lot of time arguing about who's a real Democrat, and the Republicans in Illinois spend a lot of time arguing about who's a real Republican. And so pragmatically, that's to the advantage of the Democrats. But actually, my preference is that you have that. I think it would be better if the Democrats had more of an identity. But this is hard. We act like citizens engagement. Got to get more people involved. I can't imagine not voting. I have 3 daughters who vote. I had a daughter who called me up distressed because she changed address and she wasn't going to get to vote. And so I explained to her about the Help America Vote Act, and she went and browbeat the poll watcher into probably casting an illegal ballot. But she really wanted to participate. So that doesn't make any sense to me that people wouldn't want to be engaged, and yet it's just, it's that 63%. This is, civic engagement is great. That's a terrific goal, getting more people involved. But it's like the recipe for elephant stew. The recipe for elephant stew is with take one elephant. And if you can get by the first step, it's really easy to make elephant stew. You just have to get the elephant. And so this is hard. This is really hard. I'm really interested in the next panel.
Terry,
Yeah.
Jumping at the...
All right. Well, as so often, I'm going to disagree.
Okay.
I actually think that education of voters belongs to more than just the political parties, and that open primaries will help inform that. And I think it's part of a long-term campaign. I don't think there's any silver bullet. I don't think campaign finance is going to fix things, ethics reform, any of these things. I think open primaries will get to, if it's part of a larger campaign, and I know you're shaking your head, so I'm going to just keep going.
No, go ahead.
But I think that it's part of a longer campaign. I think when we talk about these things in isolation, that is a problem. The other thing is, why stop there? Let's look at the entire electoral system in Illinois. Why aren't we looking at instant runoff voting, cumulative voting, something more than just winner takes all, which I know your response is going to be.
Oh, no. It'll be uncharacteristically brief, especially for this panel. Number one, the system you described, David, works perfectly in Louisiana. That's their system. And we know how reform-minded they are. Number two, the cumulative voting. I think the governor would agree on that. Illinois wasn't doing a great job before the cutback amendment. It's doing a lot worse since because in the name of reform, we literally took away competition, and more importantly than that, we took away the notion of walking down the middle aisle in the General Assembly. And George Ryan, who no matter what's happened to him, I'll always have a lasting affection for him because he was able to work both sides of the aisle. Now what you have are people running, this election's a crucial, on this primary, for many people, is a 10-year term. You win the primary now, and you're in a one-party area, you're good for 10 years until the next 2 elections. So that cutback amendment was stupid. There was a guy who I debated on that, and I guess he won, and now he really won because now he's the governor. But the whole notion of that, the argument was it would mean more competition, it would mean saving money, it would mean less bills introduced. All wrong, wrong, wrong. Sometimes the cure that reformers try and produce is worse than the disease. And the Illinois General Assembly has gone downhill. Oh, one final point for one person in this room. It also created the ability for the leaders to dominate their caucus.
Question, Tom. Wait a minute, we need a mic for you.
Since Paul is so interested in facts, one of the things that we have to think about in the cumulative voting 3-member districts that existed, that the Democratic Party, for the most part in Chicago, controlled the Republican candidate.
Not true. Not true.
Yes. They controlled who got elected.
Not
and
true.
They did.
I mean, you're saying 2 and 2 is 5.
They
One
did.
at a time.
And in other areas, it's the same thing. You got a few independents on the lakefront who had something to say and had some influence in the legislature, but not much. And you had one-party control most of the other parts of the state, even though it was hidden behind the so-called 3-member districts.
Let's see, one more
Let the
question.
governor respond to that when he has his time, but that is absolutely not true. The best Republicans, some of the best Republicans,
Teresa.
came out of Chicago during cumulative voting. And I can name Sandquist, Peters, you could go down the list. They were not controlled by the Democratic
And the
Party.
First Ward.
No, but how about the West Side? How about the West Side Block? How about,
Teresa.
the thing is, you're talking about individual examples, but does not represent the whole. You're just,
And
you've got a
it's
few
better now.
examples.
And it's better now. There are no Republicans.
Okay. Teresa.
Teresa Amato, Citizen Works. Kent Redfield talked about the culture of culture in government facilitating the culture of corruption, and Paul about how officials really don't want more than a couple of people to show up, if anyone, to interrupt local government meetings. Terry, who is the executive director of the Citizen Advocacy Center, I know because I did, spends years going every night, every other night, to local government meetings where public officials who have been put there by the citizenry actively dissuade the public from participating. They learn in a culture of non-facilitation of their participation. They're told to shut up, sit down, don't make comment, be nice when you make comment, don't bring other people, don't be a troublemaker, don't rock the boat, don't make any kind of question that dares to defy our authority to set policy, as if they have somehow become divorced from the interests of the citizenry. There are actual manuals on how to run a public hearing so that the citizenry cannot participate. And they are facilitated and enabled by municipal and other local government attorneys who figure out ways to curtail public participation. Shouldn't we be turning this around and have a government with public officials that enable public participation?
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.